Now we are honored to have Mr. Khaled Elgindy, Mr. Josh Ruebner, and Ms. Leila Hilal join us today for the second panel of our series, Negotiating Peace, Motivations, Mechanisms, and Methods, which is a look at the effectiveness of the Palestinian strategy for negotiating a peace that complements the national interest. Khaled Elgindy is a researcher and analyst on United States policy in the Middle East. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. From 2004 to 2009, he served with the Negotiation Support Unit in Ramallah as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership on permanent status negotiations with Israel. He was a key participant in the most recent round of negotiations launched at Annapolis in November 2007. So welcome. Josh Ruebner is a political activist and frequent speaker on Palestinian issues. He's currently the National Advocacy Director of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation and a former analyst in Middle East affairs at the Congressional Research Service. He's the author of the forthcoming book, tentatively entitled Shattered Hopes, Obama and the Quest for Israeli-Palestinian Peace. Leila Hilal is a widely published consultant on conflict mediation policies in the Middle East. She's currently the director of the New America Foundation Middle East Task Force. From 2002 to 2007, she served as a legal advisor to the Palestinian Negotiations Department and acted as an external advisor to the Palestinian negotiation team as part of the Annapolis bilateral peace talks of 2008. So again, welcome to both of you. We will begin with remarks from our speakers, followed by a question and answer session. And for those of you joining us via our live webcast, or Twitter, you too can participate by tweeting your questions to @PalestineCenter. Now, without further ado, please let us welcome our panelists.
I guess I'm starting. Thank you, Marianne, and thank you to the Palestine Center for having us. I think this is a very timely topic. It's one that, unfortunately, given events around the region, is not getting, I think, its due attention, specifically in this city, but we'll try to remedy that to the extent that we can on some level. Before I get into the substance of my talk, just a couple points by way of framing the issue, at least as I see it. I think it's important to make a couple distinctions between concepts that are often used interchangeably, particularly by U.S. policymakers and sometimes activists. But there's a distinction between, and it's intuitive, it's obvious, but sometimes they're used interchangeably. The peace process is a term that we're all familiar with, negotiations, and the two-state solution. These are not necessarily equal. They theoretically ought to be complementary and working in unison, but as I think, at least in my presentation, I'll be pointing out, that's not actually the case. The peace process is, to put it in succinct terms, is the negotiations infrastructure. It's the policies and procedures and the mechanisms that go, again, ostensibly in support of, or that are designed to support a negotiations process between Israelis and Palestinians. And of course, the two-state solution is the goal of both the quote-unquote peace process and of the negotiations. That said, the failure of the peace process, I think, has serious implications. So they're not all the same thing, but clearly the failure of the peace process, I think, has implications for the two-state solution itself. So I'm going to take a bit of a broad view of this thing called the peace process and try to pick apart why I think it has failed, and probably was destined to fail from the outset, just simply by its very structure. But before getting into what I see as the reasons for its failure, just to kind of maybe start with some misperceptions or myths. The first myth that is, I think, prevalent around Washington is that the Arab Spring killed the peace process. The Arab Spring didn't kill the peace process. The peace process was already dead. If it wasn't already dead, then it was at least brain dead and comatose for a very, very long time. What the Arab Spring did, I'll get into that maybe towards the end of my presentation. The second myth that you hear around Washington is that, particularly from policymakers, is, well, we can't want it more than the parties do. And implicit in that statement is a notion that somehow that the parties can do it on their own. And that is simply not the case. If the parties could do it on their own, clearly they would have. But we have, obviously, a vast power imbalance as well as other circumstances that don't allow the parties to do it on their own. In a way that's it's a cop-out. And then lastly, what is maybe a partial myth, or at least is an exaggeration, is that in my view, and this is probably the most controversial of the 3 points, is that the gaps simply are too wide. Frankly, I think on this, the jury is still out. I think you could make a very compelling argument that the gaps are too wide, that it's, in other words, impossible to negotiate a two-state solution because the minimal Palestinian demands simply don't meet the maximum Israeli capacity to meet those demands. So there is that argument, but I think it's probably overstated. I think it's theoretically possible to arrive at a two-state solution. In my own view is that the problems with the peace process have less to do with substance than they do with the process itself. So getting into the actual reasons, I think, again, these will be intuitive, but I'll break them down in explicit terms. The first is the one I already referenced, which is the huge imbalance in power. Clearly, you have two parties who are not equals. One is the occupier, one is the occupied. One has vast diplomatic, military, strategic resources at its disposal. The other lacks those same resources and assets. And so clearly a negotiations process needs outside intervention to help level the playing field on some level. At least that's the theory. And that's why Palestinians, of course, have always preferred internationalization of the conflict, and within that, Arabization, relying on Egypt, relying on other powers in the region to make up for that imbalance in power. But the reality that we've seen, for example, if you take the quartet, the group that includes the United States, Russia, the European Union, and the United Nations, that is supposed to represent the international community, the international consensus on arriving at a diplomatic process. What the quartet is in reality is fake multilateralism. It's not a genuinely multilateral approach. It is like Oslo, like I would say the Madrid process before Oslo was close to being genuinely multilateral, but of course it had its flaws. And I would say that what the quartet has actually done as one of the mechanisms that is designed to serve this peace process is it's actually, if you can imagine, exaggerated the imbalance in power. It's actually increased the imbalance of power more than currently exists, and that's on both levels, at the diplomatic level and at the level of the parties. Between Israelis and Palestinians, it exaggerated the difference, the gap. And in terms of the international community, U.S., of course, have always been taking a leadership role, but I would say the quartet has given the U.S. Even greater dominance over this process. So again, it's kind of fake multilateralism. Secondly, the purpose, the goal of the process was distorted from a very early stage. And again, I think the quartet is a useful model in looking at the quartet. I mean, looking at the peace process. Essentially, it took what was supposed to be a bilateral process mediating between two sides of a conflict into micromanaging the politics and affairs of one side, namely the Palestinians. So the whole purpose of third-party mediation was simply distorted. It's a phenomenon that I refer to as microlateralism as opposed to bilateral or multilateralism. And it's one of the reasons why I think we've seen this increase in process for its own sake. As you know, this has been a key problem with this process for a very long time, in that U.S. policymakers are focused with preserving the trappings of a process, irrespective of whether there's any substance, whether there's any movement in that process, or whether it, in fact, as I would argue, it is having opposite effects, and that is actually harming prospects for a negotiated settlement. And the third point is the process has been simply too fragmented and detached from reality to again, this is sort of related to the process for its own sake. It's too piecemeal, it's too disconnected for it to have any meaning for the parties. And we see that in the classic, you know, Leila and I worked together on negotiations, and we saw this in the ongoing dynamic. There was this desire to distinguish between day-to-day events and day-to-day negotiations, events on day-to-day issues, and what we call permanent status. And of course, the two are linked. And we see this also perpetuated in distinctions made between economic progress or state building, but no progress at the diplomatic or political level, when in fact these are all interconnected and interdependent. And more tangibly, there is a literal fragmentation, certainly of the West Bank, and even you know, certainly between the West Bank and Gaza, but even within the West Bank itself, there's a territorial and demographic fragmentation that is happening on the ground. At a political level also, between Hamas and Fatah, this kind of, you know, dismantling of the constituent parts of reality in order, I mean, the process has actually contributed to this disaggregation and incoherence of the current reality. An analogy that I often make with American and other policymakers is it's like disassembling the parts of an engine and then wondering why the car doesn't work. Is, you know, taking apart all the pieces and lay them all on the side, and now we can analyze them and clean them. But why does the car not move? And it's not a you know, an exact one-to-one sort of analogy, but I think it's useful. There are, of course, many examples of this imbalance, and you know, these three issues are interconnected. All you have to do is look at, for example, the roadmap, the treatment of the roadmap versus the so-called quartet principles. The roadmap is the official plan of the quartet, and hence the international community. It's enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution, and it was completely neglected and thrown by the wayside almost at the very moment that it was produced. And then you take this other quartet utterance that they made in response to an event that they condoned, by the way, a Palestinian election, and it has become kind of sacrosanct. It's become virtually scripture in terms of how it is appealed. So again, you see the imbalance on how it is applied from one side to the other. The idea of a settlement freeze, which is in the roadmap, that was completely forgotten. But that Hamas has to observe these three conditions, well, that is, we're going to adhere to that to the letter. And so there's a clear imbalance. An interesting concept, I think, especially in the context of this of the Arab Spring, is there's all of the lessons of the Arab Spring that are being internalized by American policymakers and by Europeans and others, that we can't control the affairs, we can't determine outcomes of elections, we can't micromanage the affairs of these countries. You know, all of the kind of infantilizing, micromanaging approach to the Arab world has been set aside, with the exception of the Palestinian case, where you see a perpetuation and a deepening of this kind of a mindset of, again, what I refer to as microlateralism. Just to give you a quick quote from the State Department spokeswoman Victoria Nuland last spring in response to a question about Palestinian reconciliation, and this is a quote, she says, "What matters to us And what matters to the process that we are trying to keep on track here is that Abbas remain the president, that Fayyad remains the prime minister. So we're not going to speculate on what the effect might be. In essence, she's saying that, Palestinians can do whatever they want as long as these two internal domestic political realities remain exactly as we want them. As opposed to, they would never do that in Egypt. They may be ambivalent about a Muslim Brotherhood member becoming president or have different views on different things, but they certainly, it's at least one lesson that has been internalized but completely neglected on the Palestinian side. And I think, another reality is that there's a complete disregard for Palestinian domestic needs, aspirations, and even Palestinian politics. One of the things that I often tell U.S. policymakers is that it's a mistake to assume that the Palestinians' penultimate goal is statehood per se, as opposed to something broader like freedom, which can be achieved in different forms. And that leads them to think that they'll accept any state in whatever shape. And I think that's a mistake. Another lesson that hasn't been learned is that Palestinians, just like the leadership in Syria, just like governments in Egypt and Tunisia and Bahrain and elsewhere, also need political legitimacy. They need domestic legitimacy. And this is not an issue that a lot of American policymakers lose sleep over, but it's something that they ought to. And in that context, the idea that you could take a divided Palestinian leadership and somehow forge an agreement is again another one of these bizarre standouts vis-a-vis the rest of the region, where there's a focus on consensus building and that that there's no one party that can make a constitution on its own and that can go forward on its own. As in Egypt and Tunisia, there's this emphasis on consensus building, except in the Palestinian case. Palestinians are expected to make an agreement with Israel, while there's these huge kind of social and political division, notwithstanding the fact that for Palestinians, the idea of a permanent status agreement is their constitutional moment. I would say it's even more existential than that. Constitutions can be revised, but the state, once it's negotiated with Israel, is more or less a permanent reality. So I'll just end with that, and I have a couple more points that we can elaborate on in the Q&A.
Sure.
Well, thank you very much, Palestine Center interns, for inviting me to be a part of this distinguished panel. I appreciate the opportunity. Especially as Marion mentioned, I'm working right now on a book examining the Obama administration's strategy toward resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of try out some of my material on an audience to see if you think I'm on the right track or not. I want to make 4 brief points about Obama administration's strategy toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One is that despite the changed rhetorical style of the Obama administration, despite the president himself really expressing unprecedented sympathy for the plight of the Palestinian people when he addressed the Muslim world in Cairo in June of 2009, the reality has been that the MO, the modus operandi of the Obama administration has been no different than Bush 1, no different than Clinton, and no different than Bush 2 in terms of how the negotiations are actually structured. This is peace process negotiator, U.S. peace process negotiator, Dennis Ross, describing the process in his book, The Missing Piece, that 900-page self-justification tome of why he failed over the course of 2 decades to bring about Israeli-Palestinian peace. He described the process as, quote, selling. Here's what he said. Selling became part of our modus operandi, beginning a pattern that would characterize our approach throughout the Bush and Clinton years. We would take Israeli ideas, or ideas that the Israelis could live with, and work them over, trying to increase their attractiveness to the Arabs. Notice the undifferentiated mass of Arabs as opposed to actual nationalities, while trying to get the Arabs to scale back their expectations. Now, is it any wonder then that the United States failed so miserably in its self-declared role of being an honest broker to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process when this was their declared modus operandi, to take Israeli ideas, to work them over, and to force them on Palestinians? Now, unfortunately, what I think Palestinians have realized over the course of the Obama era is that the reality has not changed, and I think that this was demonstrated most dramatically in a series of very vexatious meetings between George Mitchell and his negotiating team. George Mitchell was, of course, the U.S. Special Envoy for Middle East Peace until he resigned in shame in May 2011, and the Negotiations Support Unit of the Palestinian negotiating team. They held two very vexatious meetings on September 16th and September 17th of 2009. And to set the scene for you, this was about a week before the famous trilateral meeting at the UN between Obama, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, and PA President Mahmoud Abbas. And in these meetings, the United States revealed for the first time, by the way, this is all found from Al Jazeera's Palestine papers. In these leaks, the United States reveals for the first time that they've been going behind the back of the Palestinians in order to cut a deal with Israel on the quote-unquote settlement moratorium. By this time, the United States had already given up trying to get Israel to completely free settlements, as was its obligation to do so in the 2003 roadmap, and instead to craft a deal that the Palestinians could live with that was something less than an actual settlement freeze, which was Israel's quote-unquote moratorium. So here's Mitchell's team, which was led by David Hale, who was his deputy at the time, now his replacement, opening the meeting by trying to assuage, quote, Palestinian misgivings regarding the quality of the package with Israel. So from the outset, the United States understands that what they're offering the Palestinians is unacceptable. But the Palestinians, they shouldn't hold out for a comprehensive freeze on Israeli settlements because, after all, according to David Hale, this is a quote from the minutes of the meeting, quote, a freeze is a flexible concept. Well, a freeze is not a flexible concept. If you look at the roadmap says very clearly that Israel has to stop all settlement construction, including the so-called natural growth of settlements. And then David Hale tries to convince Palestinians that, quote, restraints on settlements is better than unrestricted growth everywhere. So a glass half full is better than a glass half empty in Hale's mind, I guess. He continues to say that, quote, we cannot force a sovereign government to do anything. We can use persuasion and negotiations and shared interests instead. Well, Saeb Erekat, who was the head Palestinian negotiator, replies to this, of course you could if you wanted. How do you think this will reflect on the credibility of the United States if you can't get this done, referring to a full Israeli settlement freeze? And then this is my favorite line, I think, from this interaction from Dan Shapiro, who was at the time the head of Israeli-Palestinian affairs on the National Security Council, now the U.S. ambassador to Israel. Shapiro tells the Palestinians not to tell them about who's credible or not. Shapiro says, we make the call on our own credibility. Well, the U.S. credibility on the quote-unquote peace process is completely shot, exactly because of this MO of working over Israeli ideas and then trying to force them on the quote-unquote Arabs. Point number two. During the Obama administration, there was a continuation of this notion that we should have negotiations for the sake of negotiations, or more process for the sake of process, as Khaled called it. This, I think, was recognized or acknowledged most clearly by George Mitchell himself in the run-up to the resumption of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, which lasted a whole of 3 days in September of 2010. When he announced the resumption of negotiations on August 20th, 2010, Mitchell actually threw out the window 20 years of history of U.S. involvement in the peace process by saying this, quote, only the parties can determine terms of reference and basis for negotiation, and they will do so when they meet and discuss these matters. So in other words, UN Security Council resolutions don't matter. the history of negotiations and what was agreed to at Annapolis, as my two co-panelists can testify to, didn't matter. What mattered was getting the negotiations underway and hoping that Israelis and Palestinians could just work it out without any terms of reference, without any reference to UN Security Council resolutions and so forth. This was obviously a very flawed strategy on the Obama administration's part. The day before the negotiations opened on August 31st, 2010, Mitchell was asked in a press briefing, quote, whether the long history of Israeli-Palestinian negotiation has been beneficial or harmful. And here's what Mitchell said. It's actually been both in some respects. Beneficial in the sense that this has been discussed so often that people have a good sense of what the principal issues are and how they might be resolved. Harmful in the sense that it's created attitudes among many in the region that it's a never-ending process, that it's gone on for a very long time and will go on forever. Now, to set the stage for the resumption of the negotiations, which if you look at the documentary evidence available not only in the Palestine papers but in WikiLeaks as well, you'll see how the United States browbeat the Palestinian negotiating team back to the table, even though both the United States and the Palestinians recognized that there was absolutely no chance of success for the negotiations. It was negotiations for the sake of negotiations. And to convene negotiations, as Khaled mentioned, by having these negotiations, you raise hopes. And when you fail at the negotiations, you dash those hopes. And it was just astounding for someone as experienced a diplomat as George Mitchell, who led end to a very intractable conflict in Northern Ireland in the 1980s. Why this is rebounding here. To see him convene negotiations just 3 weeks before Israel's quote-unquote settlement moratorium expired, knowing that this moratorium in and of itself wasn't sufficient to get Palestinians back to the table in the first place, and also knowing that there was no possible way that Israel would extend the so-called moratorium after it ended. Well, as anyone could have predicted, these negotiations blew up in the face of the United States just 3 weeks later and have been permanently stalled since then. Point number 3 is what I call peace process über alles, or peace process above all else. In other words, everything has to be sublimated to the quote-unquote peace process, and any alternative strategy that challenges the hegemony of the peace process discourse is something to be confronted and denied and destroyed by the United States, is an encroachment upon the U.S.'s sort of arrogated status to itself as the mediator to this quote-unquote peace process. Now here's the Bush administration back in 2004 arguing in front of the International Court of Justice why the ICJ had absolutely no jurisdiction to rule on whether Israel's wall in the West Bank was legal or not. Here's what the Bush administration says. The U.S. believes that the giving of an advisory opinion in this matter risks undermining the peace process and politicizing the court. So, in other words, an international institution could not adjudicate an Israeli-Palestinian issue because of the quote-unquote peace process, and the existence of the peace process in 2004 is kind of like the existence of the peace process today. In other words, non-existent. Compare that statement from the Bush administration to what the Obama administration has been saying. Here is Susan Rice, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, explaining why the United States in February 2011 had to veto a resolution in the Security Council condemning Israeli settlements after the Obama administration had spent its first 2 years in office condemning Israeli settlements. Here's what Rice said, trying to explain this logically. The resolution, quote, must be measured against one overriding standard. Will it move the parties closer to negotiations and an agreement? And in her mind, of course, if the Security Council weighed in on whether Israel settlements were legal or not, and of course we've all been very educated over the last few days from the Levy Commission that, of course, Israel settlements are legal after all. Who knew? I didn't. It's news to me. There's no occupation either. and the earth is flat. So Rice said that, of course, the United States can't vote for this resolution because if the United Nations were to pass a resolution condemning Israeli settlements, this, quote, risks hardening the position of both sides. It could encourage the parties to stay out of negotiations, as if there were negotiations happening then, and if and when they did resume, to return to the Security Council whenever they hit an impasse. Now, I could pull up similar statements to why the United States opposed Palestinian UN membership, why the Obama administration opposed the recommendations of the Goldstone report, why the United States worked to undermine the UN from investigating Israel's attack on the flotilla. All of these things were rejected by the Obama administration because it didn't fit into its peace process paradigm. And anything that didn't fit into this paradigm undermined that so-called peace process. Now, to conclude, what I think this has led to by the Palestinian negotiating team, I think rather belatedly, is the fact that Palestinians can never get a fair shake out of any U.S.-dominated peace process. It's simply impossible based on the political realities of the United States. And therefore, there's been a very conscious decision to what I call re-internationalize the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by taking it out of this U.S.-dominated context of failure that we've seen for the last 2 decades plus, and moving it back to where the issue belongs, and that is within the UN, which is more fair than the United States, which bases its actions on human rights standards and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and international law and the Fourth Geneva Conventions and so forth. The United States often argues that the UN is not an impartial venue to adjudicate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the opposite is true. The UN is the exact appropriate venue to impartially adjudicate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In that September 2009 very contentious set of meetings between the U.S. and the Palestinian negotiating team, Saeb Erekat, the head of the Palestinian negotiating team, said, "I've been doing this for 16 years. This is the last shot." And I think it's pretty clear from actions subsequent to the demise of the quote-unquote peace process in September 2010 that Palestinians are very serious about this was the last shot at a U.S.-dominated peace process. And I think for us, the challenge is to continue to undercut the claim that the United States is an honest broker, and to do that is not hard. All you need to do is look at Dennis Ross's own declarations on the subject, and to help bring this issue back to the UN in order to create the favorable circumstances for an eventual resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, Josh, it's interesting because you've obviously placed a lot of responsibility and blame at the feet of the U.S., but the Palestinians, I think, also have a role to play in the current situation. And I'm going to speak just a little bit about where the Palestinian strategy stands now and some of the challenges that face the Palestinians in terms of getting out of the current stalemate. You said that the Palestinians have, I think you meant that the Palestinians have clearly intended to internationalize their strategy, but I don't think it's that clear. I think in the past year and a half, the Palestinians have been pursuing three directions, one of which is negotiation with Israel. We had a negotiation or talks or some kind of talk between Palestinians and Israelis that was sponsored by the Jordanians in January. We've had some direct talking between Palestinians, between Saeb Erekat and different Israeli officials that have not been claimed as talks, but somehow they're meeting and they're discussing something. So I think there's still a semblance of a negotiation track underway. There's also a direction of internal political reconciliation with Hamas. that the PLO stated its commitment to. And then the third one is this international diplomatic effort to advance Palestinian statehood at the UN. But I think with each of these strands of processing or effort, we haven't seen the Palestinians wholeheartedly commit to any of them. And nor have we seen an explanation nor do we have an understanding of how these three strands fit together. I mean, we have to understand that the Palestinian leadership chose to go to the UN Security Council rather than the UN General Assembly. And in doing that, they knew that they would get a clear veto from the US, that it would be a dead end. So why is it that they didn't go to the General Assembly? Was it strategic in the sense that they were leaving different options open for the future? Was it that there was an effort to sort of engage public opinion, or was it an intention really to internationalize the strategy? And there isn't real clarity on that. And I think, the Palestinians have had some success in gaining statehood status at UNESCO, which is significant. But the International Criminal Court rejected the Palestinian petition for state status and the ability to approach the court because the ICC said that the Palestinian is a non-member state in the UN. And that's a very decisive opinion that stands on the record, that the Palestinians have not been able to clear this hurdle of admission to the UN as a full state. Now, Hamas is another player in the game. And what is Hamas's direction? Well, Hamas has stated its own commitment to reconciliation, but is also seemingly playing games. It's just recently defied the Electoral Commission and saying that they're not going to participate and allow the Commission to register for national elections. So Hamas is sort of also backed away from reconciliation, as has the PLO. And its primary approach seems to entrench its control in Gaza, perhaps waiting out to see what happens with the Arab Spring. But it's not pursuing violence, but it hasn't presented another strategy. Civil society is the third sort of player on the Palestinian scene, and while the political factions are sort of treading water, Palestinian civil society activism and intellectual elites are trying to move forward with different initiatives, such as support for boycott, divestment, sanctions vis-a-vis Israel, civil disobedience, nonviolent struggle, and widening questions and criticism of the two-state solution. But yet we've had no major significant third Palestinian force emerge. So we're in quite a strategic stalemate on the Palestinian side. And I think, for the past 2 decades, the Palestinian leadership has sort of based the prospect of a political settlement on the notion that if we say that we will ask for the minimal we will put forward the minimal demands on permanent status. And the Israelis will then see it in their self-interest to preserve the Jewish state. And the US will be motivated by everyone's pragmatism to push forward toward the two-state solution. So Palestinians say we'll give up the right of return in order for the 67 borders, and this is a minimal equation that meets Israeli practical interests in saving the Jewish democratic state. But this equation has failed to produce progress. And I think now the Palestinians really are in a quagmire because they have invested quite a lot in another sort of strategic strand, which is state building. And through, again, drawing on this notion of pragmatism in convincing the U.S. and other international sponsors to push the process forward, the Palestinians said, we will build our state institutions. We will show that we are ready for statehood. And this will convince the international community to push Israel to end its occupation or scale it back significantly. And that process has failed, but in the meantime, the PA is more entrenched and simultaneously more dependent on Israel, more dependent on the international donors. And so its flexibility, political flexibility to challenge the status quo has been narrowed. Going to the UN was met with U.S. punitive action when the Congress withheld development assistance funds or put a hold on it. Subsequently, that hold has been lifted, but the Palestinians were told that if you challenge this status quo of stalemate, of process for process without outcome, we will withdraw our external assistance. And so that locks the Palestinians in dependence on Israel for the tax revenues. Israel is collecting the customs revenue, which is a major source of revenue for the PA, is forcing the Palestinians to continue cooperating with Israel, again narrowing the political space for Palestinian strategic movement. The regional uncertainty right now has put the Palestinians in a very difficult position. There is very little international leverage right now for the Palestinians as the world looks on to other conflicts, and presumably Hamas is already also sort of waiting out the situation as Islamists rise to power in Tunisia and Egypt, and the U.S. warms to Islamists. Is there perhaps a new opening for Hamas? So there is a bit of a playing a waiting game. I think the PA has also, through the years of negotiations, sidelined civil society because of their premise of minimal asks. They have not really reached out to civil society. Rather, they've been afraid of engaging them because they see potential for civil society to challenge this premise. And so when the PA went to the Security Council and applied for statehood in September 2011, they sought to draw up street support. And you saw the public square in Ramallah was filled with people cheering on Mahmoud Abbas as he gave this very emotional speech in the General Assembly. So there was an effort and a response to public opinion at that point. I think reconciliation has also been a response, or the effort to achieve reconciliation has been a response to public opinion. But in fact, the PLO is disconnected from the masses. And civil society is similarly disconnected. So there isn't a mass to draw on to generate pressure and movement and momentum in one particular direction. So this impasse is entrenched on the Palestinian side, and I think there's a large question about the role and the continuing existence of the PA and what role that plays in preventing the Palestinians from developing a strategy that would draw on international law and international legitimacy. And so there's a question of how can you balance this commitment to diplomacy with a need to leverage international law. What are the options for the PA and the Palestinians? I mean, a lot of people are dependent on PA salaries, and a lot of people are invested in the relative stability or quiet that comes through PA-Israeli cooperation. And the PA is a service provider in the territory. So you cannot simply withdraw the PA what are the solutions to get the Palestinians out of the box that they've found themselves in terms of dependency on Israel and the international community. And then I think, what are the specific asks for the U.S., for other donor countries, for the BRICS states? Are there other states that can come in and play a role if the U.S. is not able to? And what role could they play? What to ask of the emerging Arab order? And then finally, is this two-state outcome realistic, or do we need to think of alternative strategies, paradigms?
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yeah, Josh said that the United Nations would be a much better broker than the United States. Anything would be a better broker than the United States. But Leila was talking about the Palestinians having gone to the Security Council, and I don't know whatever happened with that. I mean, it's disappeared. What did happen with that? I lose words. But the request for statehood, or whatever it was that they asked for at the Security Council. Either one of you.
Do you want to take more than one question, or should we answer?
Oh, I guess we can take 2 or 3 questions at a time.
Hi, this is for Ms. Hilal. I was just wondering, you had mentioned that the sort of like strategy, there was this minimum demand premise strategy on the part of the PA or the PA negotiating team. And I was just wondering what the reasoning behind that was, because it seems counterintuitive to how you would normally approach negotiations.
Do we have a third question for now?
Paul Verdine with Friends of Sabeel North America. I would like to ask the panelists one by one whether you think, since the time of Rabin, if not before, whether Israel has been negotiating in good faith, or is their public position two-state solution a complete sham, while in reality they are slowly and inexorably hoping to take over all the Palestinian territories?
Thank you.
Yeah, that a statement?
So do you want to answer one by one, or do you want to go through the questions? Whichever works better for you.
I'll start. So the Palestinian application for statehood was submitted in September 2011, and then the Security Council, by its common procedure, referred it to committee for consideration. And the committee is essentially all the members of the Security Council. So it's now sitting in committee. And obviously the U.S. has said it would veto, and it's not clear whether the Palestinians would have enough support even to get a winning vote. So it's basically just sitting there. Now, it can go to the General Assembly. It doesn't have to wait for a decision. It can still go to the General Assembly, but the General Assembly only has the power to recommend to the Security Council to consider admitting Palestine as a member state. So what comes out of the General Assembly would be considerably less than the request that's pending before the Security Council.
And they don't have a deadline?
No, essentially no deadline. So, but to be fair, when there was decolonization, the process of decolonization, states used to go repeatedly to the Security Council and ask for membership. Those membership applications would be defeated, but then they would reapproach. So countries have approached the Security Council time and time again. But I think this choice of going to the Security Council was questioned by a lot of people because the Palestinians would have gotten much more support in the General Assembly.
Can I just weigh in on that?
Yeah.
Is that how you want to do it?
Yeah, sure.
I just thought I would weigh in on the same point on the UN bid. I think Leila excellently summarized the three components of this Palestinian strategy or non-strategy, or the tactical pivot points that it's pursuing. Theoretically, all three of those could constitute a single strategy, could be part of a broader strategy. That they're not mutually exclusive. In other words, you could pursue national unity on the one hand, that will strengthen your negotiating position, and then you use the international community, the UN bid, as leverage in those negotiations as well. They're not incompatible, but the Palestinian approach hasn't been to do that. They've been triangulating between all three in the event. I think ultimately what they're trying to do is buy time, because they are the party of negotiations. They are the party not just of negotiations, but of a two-state solution. So if something were to happen, they've sort of teased out the UN bid for as long as they possibly can, because they know if it just fails right up, straight away, then they've limited their options and they have just the other two. They're stuck with Hamas and Israel. If reconciliation were to succeed, that would foreclose lots of other options. So it would trigger lots of sanctions by the Congress and by others, and it would create a snowball effect that they're not prepared to take. So I think what they're playing a very slow motion game, but they're inching in this direction. But for their own existential purposes, they cannot commit to any one of these. If they consummate the marriage with Hamas, they could easily be overrun, looking around the region, seeing the Islamists' success in elections. If they are defeated once and for all at the UN, well then they're stuck with the dead-end negotiations. And of course, only pursuing the negotiations track is itself a dead end. So I think they're going to tease this out for as long as they possibly can on all three fronts. My take on it.
I'll jump in on Paul's question about whether Israel's been negotiating in good faith or not since 1993 when the Oslo Accords were signed. I think it depends what you think is in the Oslo Accords and what's actually in the Oslo Accords. There's nothing in the Oslo Accords that says Israel had to stop building settlements. There's some very generic language in there that neither party should take any unilateral steps to change, that kind of thing. But there's no prohibition against settlement expansion in the Oslo Accords, and there's certainly no commitment on Israel's part to establish a Palestinian state as part of the Oslo Accords. In retrospect, looking back now 20 years, the Oslo Accords was the perfect mousetrap that was built by Israel for the Palestinians to put them in this very untenable situation, because there has never and there probably will never be a genuine Israeli offer for Palestinian statehood on the 1967 borders or anything resembling the 1967, I shouldn't say borders, armistice lines. The reality is that whether you look at Camp David in 2000 with Barak, or you look at the Annapolis process that Khaled and Leila were a part of with Olmert in 2007 and 2008, or whether you look at Netanyahu's speech from 2009, where he quote-unquote accepted a Palestinian state, these are all more or less offers for demilitarized, disconnected, fragmented, quote-unquote state that lacks any attributes of sovereignty. So has Israel been negotiating in bad faith? If you think that they should stop settlements and establish a real Palestinian state, then yes, they have been acting in bad faith. But if you actually look at what's in the Oslo Accords, I think they've stuck exactly to what the plan was.
Except for the 5-year thing.
Except for the 5-year thing. Well, it's an important point because, part of this conundrum that's faced by the Palestinians that both of you mentioned, relates to the fact that the Palestinian Authority was designed as a 5-year transitional entity. It's not a sovereign entity. It was an entity set up as an interim arrangement to govern areas of autonomy that Israel permitted the Palestinians. And that expiration of the validity of the PA ended on May 4th, 1999. And since that time, everyone's just kind of turned a blind eye and wink, wink, wink. Yeah, the Palestinian Authority is still something legitimate that is actually ruling over something, when in effect it's been a very convenient tool for Israel to kind of pull the wool over the eyes of the international community and say, this isn't even conflict, it's one between two governments, the PA has responsibilities, maybe we do as well, but they're not fulfilling theirs, so we don't have to fulfill ours. And you know, that whole dynamic of maintaining this facade of there being two equal sides has been grossly harmful to the Palestinian cause.
Right, but the Palestinians want their own national space, and they have a national identity, and you know, to the extent that the PA is lived its purpose, is something that isn't an easy question for any Palestinian to contend with. It's not, there's nothing black and white, there's not a clear answer to this problem. I mean, I think that you're hearing more and more calls for a dissolution of the PA, but you haven't seen a broad-based movement in that direction. But to answer the question of the minimum demands, I think, you know, Abu Mazen is the one who always liked to say, well, the 67 lines are, you know, it's 22% of historic Palestine. So minimum demand one is asking for the West Bank and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, which is a major historic compromise. And that was initially made in the late 80s, early 90s. And that failed to sort of convince the Israelis. And so then the Palestinians, under Oslo, once Oslo was signed and the permanent status talks started, they continued to present compromise proposals. And you're saying it's counterintuitive because you start at your highest points and you go down. And Khaled probably has something very interesting to say on this point, but the Palestinian logic, I think, was that, okay, we will accept land swaps, right? So that was the next set of compromise. We will look at land swaps so that we can begin to accommodate the settlements to a degree, not in any way that would break up our contiguity and our viability, but we will begin to negotiate around land swaps if they're equal. On the refugee question, they made a major overture that's represented now in the Arab Peace Initiative, which we want recognition of the right of return, but we will compromise on implementation of the refugees, so we won't disrupt the majority Jewish demographics inside Israel. And the whole logic of this, I think, was that this would convince the Israelis, because the Israelis would see it in their they would be rational and see it in their self-interest, that this formulation is, you know, will give them, you know, what they want ultimately, and the U.S. will see the Palestinians being pragmatic and will then, you know, push the process forward. So I think the strategic thinking on going lower has been, you know, we want to prove our pragmatic side because this will carry the day. And it hasn't, which is, to me, the great mystery. You know, why haven't the Israelis been convinced of this minimalist formulation?
I think it's precisely because it hasn't worked. That's why if Palestinians are prepared, if the Palestinian negotiators are prepared to keep making these concessions, and Israel, meanwhile, is not paying a price at the negotiating table, they're not paying a price for not being at the negotiating table, they're not paying a price for building settlements, they're not paying a price for the occupation itself is being underwritten to a large extent by the international community. And that's, you know, sort of what I alluded to, this peace process infrastructure, the Blair mission and all of these envoys who are, you know, disaggregated, disconnected from each other, serve a function. It is a kind of anesthetizing of the conflict as opposed to resolving it, as opposed to fixing it. And so you have a patient who's perpetually under anesthesia and not actually being operated on, or not actually being healed. And that's a problem. We're in this permanent transition. So I think the fact that Israel doesn't pay a price, and the Palestinians, they've called Abu Mazen's bluff each and every time. And how many times has Abu Mazen threatened to resign? And he simply doesn't. There are multiple threats to dissolve the PA, and it never happens. And so Israelis have no reason to believe that Abu Mazen would commit suicide just because he's threatened it. I think that's probably the simplest answer. I just don't believe it.
We actually have a question on Twitter, which is why were large-scale hunger strikes by Palestinians ignored by media and the international community? And unfortunately, that's also the last question we can take for today. So,
why were there hunger strikes?
No, why were large-scale hunger strikes by Palestinians ignored by the media and the international community?
I suppose you'd have to ask the media.
Well, I'm not sure I'd agree with the premise of the question. I think it was covered quite extensively by the international media, perhaps not as sympathetically as we would like, perhaps not as well or as broadly as it should have, but it was definitely covered. But you know, the reality today in 2012 is that you don't need the New York Times to write a story in order to get the story out. And this is what's fundamentally changing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in, I think, a very positive way, is because what you see right now, and Leila alluded to the actions of Palestinian civil society, what you see, whether it's the mass hunger strike, whether it's the Palestinian freedom riders, whether it's the weekly demonstrations in Belain or any of the other villages where there's constant nonviolent protest against Israeli occupation, all of these stories are getting out and reaching an international audience, including a U.S. audience. And it's making Israel and its supporters very uncomfortable because you've had, over the decades, this mantra from Israel, where's the Palestinian Gandhi? Well, the reality is that the Palestinian Gandhis are all around, if they haven't been killed or jailed by Israel. And the reality is that through the use of social media, you know, my goodness, the Palestinian freedom rides, when Palestinians went on Jewish settler-only buses, was live streamed to an audience of tens of thousands of people around the world. And the fact that they were able to live stream their act of civil disobedience ensured, I think, that they weren't brutalized by the settlers and soldiers for doing that very brave act. So I think these things are breaking through. I think they're definitely helping to reshape the landscape. And I think the more that Palestinian civil society can do this, the more alliances it'll find here in the United States.
Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you all for coming out today.